Serenbe is a place where people live, work, learn, and play in celebration of life's beauty. And we're here to share the stories that connect residents and guests to each other and to nature. This is Serenbe Stories. Today we're talking to Serenbe's master land planner, Dr. Phillip Tabb. Phill discusses sacred geometry and the spiritual and symbolic side of planning and architecture. He also reminisces about the all-nighter he pulled working on the Serenbe charrette, where the omega shape for the neighborhoods took hold, and also the weekend he, the Nygrens, and many other friends came together to build Serenbe's stone labyrinth. But first, Serenbe Stories is brought to you by the Inn at Serenbe. The Inn is nestled in the rolling countryside of bucolic Serenbe, where guests can walk on the 15 miles of trails through preserved forest land, the wildflower meadow, and the animal village. You can relax by the pool, hot tub, or in rocking chairs on wraparound porch. Play on the croquet lawn, swings, and in-ground trampolines. Connect with nature and each other, all while staying in luxurious rooms on the Inn grounds or within the community of Serenbe. Book your stay today at serenbeinn.com. Steve, it's exciting to be back and have our exciting guest today, Phillip Tabb.
Phil, it's going to be fun to reminisce. It seems like yesterday, and then when you start looking at the calendar, man, we're approaching 20 years.
Boy, it is amazing. Yeah, it's really glad to be here and to also reminisce about old times and actually to project into the next few years too.
Well, and Phill, for our listeners, is a Serenbe resident, which we absolutely love. But before that, he was and still is our master planner for Serenbe. Designed the master plan with Steve using what we call Hamlet constellation theory, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. Has been a professor at various universities, as well as a published author, as well as a sacred geometrist. So we will talk about that as well. So I want to welcome you again and just say we want to dig right in and start to hear your Serenbe story, Phill, and how you came to Serenbe the first time. And one thing I will note for everybody is that Phill has brought his diary, which is beautiful, and we will take a few photos of. But if you could start there from how did you first encounter Serenbe and Steve Nygren?
I'd be happy to. I was a department head at Washington State University at the time in Pullman, and had a full-time job. And in fact, being a department head is two jobs, I think, in one. And one day, out of the blue, I get a call from this guy that I'd never heard of, Steve Nygren, from Georgia. And I don't think I'd ever been to Georgia by that time. Mm-hmm. And he said, we've got this project that we're thinking about doing, a large environmentally oriented community. And we understand that you know Bill Browning, who was a go-between between the two of us. Mm-hmm. And he mentioned that I knew something about sacred geometry. And at about that time, I was thinking, wow, I wonder what they're thinking of me, someone who knows something about sacred geometry. And what are they thinking about how that might get applied to Serenbe? But anyway, the gist of the talk was that I was invited to come out and give a 2-hour presentation, primarily on sacred geometry, but then also on village planning or community planning. So that was in November or December of 2000, which was just about 3 months after their very first thought leader meeting in September. So in January, I flew out and spent time with Marie and Steve at the inn. And the short of this part of the story really is that I gave the presentation, and there was some really interesting touch points that resonated with both Steve and Marie in that presentation, primarily the notion of sacred geometry and what it is and that it could possibly be applied at the community scale. And secondly, the fact that one of the case studies that I brought up was Selborne Village in East Hampshire. And it happened to be a village that was about 20 minutes away from where I lived, and I had visited it many times. And it was a village that Steve and Marie had visited many times as well. And Marie's mentor actually lived there. And I think the icing on the cake was when I showed a picture of this beautiful cottage along the main street in Selborne that has a thatched roof, and it's just this beautiful brick structure that was her house.
That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I don't know if we'll be able to find a photo of that, but that would
I've
be
got
really...
one.
Do you? Oh, wonderful.
I do,
Okay,
yeah.
well, we'll definitely get a photo of that. So, Steve, tell us why or how maybe you came across the concept of sacred geometry before we get into what that is, and why did you want somebody to come and talk about that?
During my 7 years of retirement that I've talked about when we sold the restaurant company, we traveled a lot. And this woman that Marie had adopted sort of as a grandmother figure lived in this little village outside London. And Marie would go over a couple times a year, and I went over at least once a year during this period. And just became very enamored with the English village system, the footpaths, the pub, the food store, and the entire concept. And so started learning about some of the English laws that had created this balance between the dense hamlets and villages and the countryside. And of course, I was just enamored as a visitor. At that point, we weren't even considering that we would develop or seeing how it would apply here. Alice was very involved with a lot of the movements in England where sacred geometry, she knew Keith Critchlow. She knew all the people doing crop circling and really had visited a lot of the ancient sites and was part of restoring them, whether it was Stonehenge or the various folks. So Alice had really introduced us to both the concepts of sacred geometry, some of the leaders in that field in England, and then the English village system. And so during the charrette, or the conference with Rocky Mountain Institute when they were here, I asked Bill Browning if he knew anyone that knew about sacred geometry. And we were already, because sacred geometry, we knew it was in England and we wanted the English concepts. And so we were looking at all those. And I was thinking how complicated it was going to be to bring somebody over from England. And so I was reaching out. And he said, I know this guy who is a professor at Boulder. Here's his number.
Okay.
And I called, and I got Phil's ex-wife. And she was feeling very friendly towards Phill and actually gave me his number where I could reach him.
Lucky day.
And so that was the basis that it all started. And of course, at this point, we had hired Robert Marvin, who was the big environmentalist. And Robert Marvin was in his 80s, and he said, Steve, this is going to be the last thing I do. Now, Robert Marvin has done things like Brays Island and the waterfront at Beaufort and only stayed in the very southeast. We were having some lively discussions because he was not quite in line with putting high-density pods. His were much more environmentally and spread out. So this tension was already happening in what I envisioned in places while we were doing everything else in the environmental, which he was a great leader. And so we had these meetings about every 6 weeks, and we brought in different disciplines, whether it was art, agriculture, and this was the time we were bringing in sacred geometry to help inform us on how we wanted to develop. So Phill presented in the morning, and Mr. Marvin's team presented in the afternoon. Now, Mr. Marvin had gone into the hospital and was not able to join us, so his team did it. And it was just awful. It was nothing at all, and it was so bad that we couldn't even quite comment. And so after this 2 or 3 hour presentation, there was just dead silence, and I asked that we maybe have a break. And as I remember it, we walked out, and several people could just tell my face that, everyone knew it was wrong. So I had various people tugging at my saying, I know what you need, because we had other architects, we had people in the room. And so Phil and I took a walk because I was intrigued with his presentation, and it really rang true to everything that we were thinking about, whether it was the English village system and then the synchronicity of the village of Selborne that we knew so well, and Phil also knew it well. And so that was something we had just discovered that morning. And so as I remember, we walked out behind like where the vegetable garden is, and Phil says, I can do this. I can come back and we can do this. And I said, I think you can.
Well, I remember it is that I said, I don't know quite how it can be done. And that you can't lay sacred geometry on an existing plan. And Steve says, yes, well, what do we do? And I said, well, I've got a full-time job. He said, well, what do we do? And I said, okay, I'm going to come. And so then that's when we planned, I think it was about a month later, the charrette.
That's right. It was we were in pretty fast mode at that point.
So,
yes.
So Phil, can you give us a primer on sacred geometry for those of us that maybe have a sense of what it is, that it has to do with shapes? But I would love, for the layperson, can you tell us a little bit what it is and why it's important?
I knew you were going to ask me this question. And it's not an easy one to answer. But before I do, I wanted to give a little bit of background that I had the privilege to actually work with and have Keith Critchlow as one of my teachers, along with Robert Lawler and a few others. And so that's how I became familiar with what it was.
And these individuals are sort of the leaders?
Yeah, the leaders in the world, really.
Okay.
And Robert Lawler wrote a really beautiful book called Sacred Geometry. And Keith has written so many books, it's just really hard to say.
Okay.
And when I was working on my doctorate in London, I worked for Keith for a year working on the Krishnamurti Study Center. And so that was like a really direct experience of learning and applying these ideas. But to go back to the question of what is it, well, first of all, is geometry.
Okay.
And we all know what geometry is. It's everywhere. You can't look anywhere and not see geometry. So in a way, what makes it sacred? And in some ways, it's partly tied into intention.
Okay.
And it's what we might call its symbolic qualities. I could draw a square, and it's just basically a square. But if I'm really thinking about the square as representing Earth, which that particular geometry represents the earth principle, then I'm bringing in the earth principle to that particular geometry. So I'm embodying this sort of sensibility into the geometry. And another way to describe it is that various geometric systems, and in particular the ones that have what we call immeasurable qualities, the square root of 2, the square root of 3, and the square root of 5, or the square root of 5 plus 1 over 2 is golden mean geometry. So each one of these geometries have a particular resonant quality. And many of these geometries are in our bodies, especially golden mean. So when the pharaohs in Egypt and when the Greeks and when the Romans designed buildings based on these geometric principles, they were resonating with the human body.
Okay.
And in fact, the particular golden mean geometry used in the pharaoh's buildings were keyed into his particular body and size. So when you go to a sacred building, you begin to resonate with that space.
Okay.
So that's another, I guess, dimension of sacred geometry.
Can you give us examples? Because I have a few in my head, but I don't know if they're sacred geometry, like Chartres Cathedral in France. Would that be?
Yes, on multiple levels. Chartres Cathedral has many layers, one of which is what they call the Christian layer. Another layer is Platonic. It has the Platonic school there. So, and that Platonic school goes back to Pythagoras, and so that's where you have this basic geometry.
Okay.
And these various kinds of non-repeating geometries, and so they're employed in Chartres, as well as there's symbolism there with color. For example, the north portal is primarily blue and the south portal is primarily red in the stained glass.
Okay.
And so the north portal is more about the story of Mary. and the birth of Christ, where the south portal is about the life of Christ.
Okay.
And then the west portal, which is where the great, huge rose window is the life after death. And that's the portal that shines its light down on the sharp maze or the labyrinth. So these, in a way, you would say, okay, could be considered sacred geometric moves.
And a common figure a lot of people think about is the ancient pyramids.
Yes.
That's the very simple one you can visualize.
Yes.
And does Michelangelo use it in his work?
Oh, yes. It's in some ways, almost all of those in paintings, golden mean geometry was used to organize the compositions. And in buildings, it was always used. And you know what was complicated back in those days? Walls were thicker, right, than they are now. So they would do the proportions on the inside as well as having the same kinds of proportions on the outside, knowing that you had a bigger building on the outside than on the inside, which was remarkable. And in today's, it's much more difficult when you only have 4 or 6 inch wall thicknesses. So it's really difficult to do that. And most students now are not taught these kind of geometric systems anymore, unfortunately.
And I know that you created a sustainable urbanism graduate program. Is that part of it? Is sacred geometry part of that sustainable urbanism, or is that a very different
Not
track?
really. Talking about things sacred can be touchy.
Okay.
Especially when you're in a relatively conservative state like Texas.
Okay.
So we would, the way we would do it is you can talk different you can shift languages. It's like going from French to English.
Okay.
You can talk about sacred concepts, but use very common language. Terms like placemaking
Yes.
is a really good term because it's not charged.
Yes.
Okay, but placemaking could also embody spiritual ideas, right?
Sure.
Or sacred ideas. So you learned after a while how to shift between different languages talking about it. Sustainable urbanism really was a program that was designed to teach sustainability concepts at the urban scale.
Okay, so I'm going to take us back. That's really helpful. I'm going to take us back to that first charrette that you guys did together and how you sort of said, okay, I think I can do this. So tell me what happened that day and sort of, was it a 1 day, was it a 2 day, and what kind of came out of it?
Well, that was the entree to do the charrette, which happened a month later.
Okay.
Okay, so then there's some interesting stories there, too, to talk about if we want to get into them.
I want to hear them all.
But I came out with one of my students, Donovan Wick. So it was just Phil Tabb and Donovan Wick coming to Serenbe. It wasn't even called Serenbe then. But
didn't you have another student too drawing? I remember. No,
it was just Donovan for that one. One. Later on, I brought Jennifer Vecchi out when we worked on the Chat Hills. But anyway, Donovan and I showed up, and Steve and Marie are so accommodating, and we had our nice rooms at the inn. And we walked the site again, another 3.5 hours walking the site. And as I remember, we had a dinner that evening in the room with the oval table at the inn.
Yep.
And I think Rawson and his wife and Steve and Marie and Charles, I can't recall his last name, but Charles Brewer, and maybe his wife was there, and Laura Curie and her friend Andreas Duani, and Jonathan and me.
Very interesting. Okay.
So it was a very interesting one-sided dinner. It was Andreas Duani talking about all the ills of developing environmentally oriented communities, all the things that could go wrong. And the backstory of that was, well, if you hire me, then you won't have any of these problems.
Oh, okay. So he was sort of pitching himself, it sounds like, maybe.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of other stories behind that one that I didn't know about.
Okay. Okay.
And I was sitting right next to Andreas throughout most of the dinner. And I'm the one that told him about the transect. And he's written now books on the transect.
But so he found this from you.
He found that from me, and it was part of my PhD research.
Okay.
And anyway, I don't mind. It's an idea that's been used for thousands of years. So anyway, the thing that's memorable for me is walking out of that dinner. And when we passed into the hallway going towards that bar area, Steve put his hand on my shoulder and he said something like, "You're the man, no, don't worry." And
Sure.
that's all I needed, really,
Exactly.
because the next morning I was to lead the charrette. And, and I knew who Andreas Dewani was, because we'd spent many spring breaks in Seaside. So anyway, the next morning was the charrette. And like most of our charrettes, it's the first morning or even the first day is information laden. So, and usually from the larger scale, let's say Fulton County to Chat Hills, and then down to the land and Serenbe, and then down to various perspectives. There's real estate people that were there. And it wasn't SEI, but it was another engineer there talking about the quality of the land and so on. And like most of our charrettes, again, we had a wonderful dinner. And then the design time was to happen after dinner. So Laura Heery and two of her architects and Donovan and I went into the Hawthorne room, and we had tables set up with maps and everything. And Jorge Venegas, who was teaching at Georgia Tech, had provided a beautiful contour model of the site, which was incredibly helpful.
Wow.
And so the first, I would guess we started at about 7 or 8 o'clock, and everybody was just putzing around. I mean, we just could not get a handle on this thing. And Laura and her folks started up one end, like up at the inn, and started doing these detailed little designs that was slowly kind of moving down Selborne Lane. And it got to 11 o'clock, and she said, "Oh, we've got to go to bed." So she and her two architects got up and left. And we basically had nothing.
Interesting.
And we were to present to the group, I think, the following morning at 9 o'clock. And so Donovan and I just scratched our heads and said, well, we've got to do something. And I had him doing little bits and pieces. I would say, okay, give me a parking lot with 25 cars that's double loaded. Give me a cluster of, 5 homes or whatever, all to scale. And so we started building this set of drawings of bits and pieces. And then we started looking at the contour model, and then we looked at the land. And then that's when the horseshoe or the omega shapes just almost shouted out at us.
Okay.
And I had learned in taking some ecology courses that the most vital land happens between two different qualities, like a meadow and a forest, where you have that line between those two. That's where the greatest amount of vitality is. And so for Serenbe, where you have these sort of valleys and hills, the relationship between the hill and the valley is where it's really vital. So that ended up being the place where these horseshoes or omega shapes were placed. And it ended up being, you were talking about constellating urbanism, the idea that there were many of these sites. And we had identified about 4 of these sites. And so it seemed an interesting idea to create 4 hamlets in these sites. The 4th hamlet, which is where we have the education hamlet right now, was less a sort of nurturing site like that and became more like the Italian hill town.
Okay.
So we had at least 3 of these, nurturing omega shapes, and then we had the one hill town. And so Donovan and I just rushed, and we used a ton of Scotch tape and little drawings and taped it all on top of the master drawing. And then it was about, I would say, 4 o'clock. We ripped off a clean sheet of tracing paper and threw it on top of that and spent about an hour tracing the whole thing.
Okay.
And then we spent about another 20 minutes coloring it.
Wow, it's fast.
And so it was about 5 o'clock.
And you're talking 5 a.m.
A.M. And
You've been up all night.
We've been up almost all night. And we looked around, and there was just piles and piles of junk all around from tracing paper and stuff. And we said, we don't want that. We knew that Steve and Marie were going to come down at 6 or whenever they get up. So we didn't want the room to be a wreck. So we spent another 20 minutes cleaning up all the trash.
Okay.
And then we pinned the drawing up on the wall. Right as you walk in, we knew they would walk right at the drawing.
Okay.
So Donovan and I then crashed at about 5:30. And I can't remember when we got up, but it was probably around 7:30 or so. And when we went into the kitchen area, in the dining area, we could see Marie and Steve, and they had smiles on their faces. So we knew that we had done all right.
Okay. So tell me.
It was great because I remember, because I was touching in through that, and I stopped making them coffee about 2 a.m, and I couldn't believe they were still up. And I thought, well, we'll see what we get in the morning. And so I was very aware of the mess. There was rolled up paper everywhere and through that room. And it was quite a pleasant surprise to come in and to see all these concepts that at 2:00 you had.
We were getting there.
We were close to the whole piece of it, and it was amazing to see what they had brought together. Then this beautiful hand drawing. It's the hand drawing that. You have it framed at your place, don't you?
Not the original. I've got the original somewhere, or a photo of the original. I don't know where it is. But what I have in my house are copies of the one that was done a month later.
Okay.
Because what happened is we left that drawing with Steve and Marie and the rest of the folks to take a look at it and just write comments, and then a month later to give me the comments.
Okay.
And then I would redraw them, which I did. And we expanded. The first shot was very small Hamlet horseshoes, but then we began to expand those, and we articulated Serenbe Farms a little bit more, and so on. And that was a really beautiful drawing. It was something that was used by Serenbe, for years after that.
Yeah, we still have it.
Yeah, you still have it. So, yeah, that was amazing. And of course, since that time, I've been involved in probably more than a dozen or 24 charrettes with Steve and others. But I think the thing that I remember the most about them is Steve will articulate the problem or the challenge or the opportunity or what it is we're supposed to be working on. And he provides all the base maps. And again, we will walk the site wherever it is and get that firsthand information. And then he leaves us alone for a while. And then I say, listen, you can come in and interact at any time. And so he will come down, a half hour or an hour later. And inevitably, we have a question or two, which he's extremely helpful, or I have gone off on a slight tangent. That's a little unrealistic. And so we have this great way of working together because he has a depth of ideas that he draws from. And then I have an ability to kind of put these ideas down on paper.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And it's an amazing, I think, teamwork that we were able to do. And of course, then we give it to the engineers, and they take the beautiful curved line drawings and kind of chop them up a little bit, but they make them very real, which is important.
Yep.
And then, especially in the early days, I would then get a copy of the engineer's drawings, and then I would sort of round off the edges a little bit to bring it back to the sort of, scrumptious aspect of the plan.
The sensuousness. Many times I will take it, from Phil's plans, we go to the civil engineers and they look at the reality of it. And there's some things that they adjust that aren't. And then it's always a little stiff. And so I many times say, Phil, shake it up a little bit. And that's it. It's sort of like, if you can imagine that.
Well, the Serenbe site really lends itself to freehand design work.
And why is that?
Because of all the curvature nature of the site. And it's a very feminine site, and the design is feminine. So with all these wonderful curves, and they are sensuous. And it takes some time to get those curves right. And the computer really couldn't do it. I mean, it could do it, but you'd have to take an extraordinary person to be able to do it. And certainly the computer can't do it in the amount of time that we have on these charrettes. And usually the design time is about, 4 to 6 hours. Okay. Maybe a little bit longer. So doing it by freehand really, I think, was something wonderful for Serenbe.
And Phill continues to do freehand drawings, which are just beautiful. I'm sure we'll have some pictures of some of these.
Of course, there's an exhibition coming up.
Yes. We're going to have all of Phil's work on display at Gainey Hall Gallery in February. Not only some beautiful watercolors that you do, we will probably have some of the maps on display as well. I'm talking to figure out how we can incorporate that, because it's not only just to showcase your work, but it's our 15th anniversary. So I want to really highlight all that. One of the things that I just want to step back to that charrette, so it's in the morning, it's pinned up on the wall. Did you guys sneak in and see it, or was there a presentation? Or
there was a presentation. I mean, we were coming down and clearly walked in, and there wasn't, it was early, so walked in, saw what they were doing. I'd had a few hours between I saw the mess, and so I was impressed with that. And then I think we had coffee and breakfast, and then there was a more formal presentation. Others came in to see it at that point.
Right. And tell me how you overlaid sort of the concept of English villages onto it, because I know you did your PhD in that. And so can you share a little bit, for those of us maybe who haven't been to an English village, or what that really means, or maybe the village model?
Well, I had studied English villages for 5 years, and I'd learned quite a bit about them. And one of the things is that in Great Britain, there are 10,000 villages. Most of them were actually given birth in the Anglo-Saxon period, which is about 500 BC to 1066. And so that's the birth of most of these villages. And
interesting. Okay, that's where the birth of them.
Yes. And out of the 10,000 villages, 50% of them are linear, which makes sense because most of them were located on lines of either roads or paths or rivers. Okay. So they tended to be linear. So most were linear. 35% were nucleated, which means that they were evolved a little bit further than just a linear village. Nucleation meaning that they have a center.
Okay.
And usually that center was a center green and usually some sort of a market.
Yes.
So they became like market villages. And then the last 15% are what they call random, but I call them polynucleated. They're just small little clusters, that are sort of disorganized in a way.
Okay.
So that made up the kinds of village types. Now, coming to Serenbe, in a way, Serenbe has all three of those characteristics.
Okay.
Because each one of the Omega hamlets is linear. It just happens to be curved, right?
Okay.
So it's a linear village, and each of the hamlets at the apex has nucleation. So it has the green, like in Grange or in Selborne, and it has the pond in Motto. So it's nucleated, and it has a clustering of non-residential uses there as well. And then the third one, which is polynucleated, which is where the term constellated urbanism comes from, there is a constellation of these linear nucleated hamlets throughout Serenbe.
Okay.
And it's always been my contention, in a way, that Serenbe isn't a single place. I mean, it isn't a single point, and it's not a single hamlet.
Right.
But it's the whole, right? So I've always felt like Serenbe is the constellation. It's the constellation. If you were to put the plan of Serenbe up in the night sky, it would be the constellation Serenbe. And so that's where I sort of came up with that idea.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And one of the things about the English villages is a little bit about how there's sort of a clustered central commercial that then flows out from there are different types of homes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, maybe this is a good segue into the Thorburn transect.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
Yeah, but there's a Thorburn transect is basically a density gradient, meaning going from either low density from the outside to higher density on the inside, or the reverse, going from higher density on the inside to lower density on the out. And typically in an English village, you go from attached housing integrated with commercial in the center, and then slowly you go to cottage homes, and then eventually you go to estate homes, and then finally you go to farms.
Okay.
So you're going from this rural environment slowly, migrating into a more urban center. So we employed that same thing at Serenbe. And this guy, Andrew Thorburn, in 1971, published his diagram of this particular kind of transect. And there's another component to it, which I didn't mention, but the landscape also switches with the density. So when you're on the outside, you have more landscape, and the landscape acts as a filter between the street or the road and the buildings. So the houses and buildings or farms are set back.
Okay.
Then as you slowly migrate into the village, that landscape starts to thin out, and eventually when you get to the center, it flips to the back. And in the English village, it goes into walled-in gardens in the back. So you have density building up on one side, and you have the landscape building up on the other. So it's a very interesting concept. And I think probably the best example at Serenbe is looking at Selborne. Okay. It is so clear here. where you see that.
Right. And I know that coming from the inn is a great way to sort of experience that. If you come off the gravel road from the inn and drive or walk in, that's going to give you that whole experience.
And Steve was brilliant in being able to take that concept and materialize it.
Okay.
So the whole material experience of coming to Serenbe goes through that same transect. You might talk to that.
So Phill really taught me about the transects, and it seemed very natural. And so we've carried that forward. So people cannot understand through our various design review boards or landscape design review boards, they think they understand the Serenbe way. Well, no, you have to understand the transects within Serenbe, because the formation of a bush that might be very loose and fine on the outer transects will not be the appropriate thing, nor you should not have the clipped hedge that we see around the townhouses in the center. Those should not occur on your outer transect.
Oh, wow. Wow.
In the middle transects, we require front porches. But those are not required on either end of the transect when you're in the very rural or the very urban. Mm-hmm. We encourage balconies and things like that. So you really have to understand the various transitions. And generally, our crosswalks are at transect changes.
Okay, I didn't
and that gives you
that.
a better clue as to how all that happens. So this is the layers that make Serenbe so interesting, and it's why, because of the transect and sacred geometry, a common thing I hear is your pictures don't do it justice. Now, Monica, your team has incredible pictures, videos, and I still hear that, and I realize it's because you have to feel it.
Yeah.
And when you're here on the streets, you feel it in a very different way than you're just visually seeing it.
Well, just walking along the road, let's say, or along the sidewalk, and then the sidewalk stop. Mm-hmm. A sidewalk is an urban idea, right?
Right.
And then you go to the road, which is a rural idea if you're walking out of Selborne going towards the inn.
Yeah. And so when you're at Serenbe, and you'll notice when we transition from a concrete sidewalk to an asphalt path, that is when you have left the hamlet. And concrete paths are that clue that you're now in permanent preserved areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's pretty interesting. And then the other end, the dense end, the buildings do two things. One is that they go closer to one another, and then they go closer to the street until you get to the apex of the omega, where the buildings are right up to the sidewalk and right up to one another.
Right.
And so what that does, it enables the creation of what we call an outdoor room. It's a public outdoor room.
Yes.
And when you close the street off, for one of your markets or a fair or whatever, that is an outdoor room.
Right.
And so for each area, once the civil engineers have staked the future roads, and this started with the very first piece of Selborne and until today, Phill and I then walk the center line of that staked road and determine if the grades that are planned are correct. And then we stop at every lot. We have the map, and we determine where the front of that house sits from the center curve, or the curb, the future curb, and the elevation height of that house, not the variable, but what is the height. And so then from that, we develop a lot specification sheet that gives this information to the future architect for that site.
Right. Well, the thoughtfulness. I mean, I see it, and I'm aware of it, being here, but it's so interesting to hear even more, because I'm always learn something new. But I think that's what you're feeling when you're here. Besides this, I thought this was really interesting, this sort of nurturing, nourishment or sensuality. But that nurturing, there is something very nurturing about being here, and it's the way that it is laid out, and the way, the thoughtfulness, to your point, like even how the bushes are trimmed or not trimmed. I had never realized that. Do you think that this is replicable? I mean, I know that, we're we're a model and these are principles that we are utilizing to build it. But like, to me, it's like everybody should be building this way. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start by, what are we talking about replicating? Because Serenbe has so many layers of what it is. For example, would we push replicating the omega forms? Okay, maybe not.
Okay.
It really depends on the site. Or another way to say, what are the benefits of the omega form versus just having a straight linear village or having more of a gridded town-like village? And so these are questions that I would ask about its replication.
Right.
I like the idea of constellating because you can constellate anything.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we discovered in our research was that a pedestrian community, in order for it to encourage being pedestrian, you need to be within a 1 kilometer or a 1 mile diameter circle.
Oh.
If you're beyond that, then you discourage walking.
Interesting.
So the idea, depending on the size of these things, would be that this notion of replicating them into a constellation is a good idea. So I think that's something that can be is a model that could be used. I'm not sure the omega form is. It's really unique to Serenbe.
Well, I think specifically what can be replicated is thoughtful design in the built environment that relates to nature rather than imposing a design on nature. And now there is a lot of interest in Serenbe, and that's why we've launched Nygren Placemaking as a conference to help share the principles rather than trying to copy the physical. And I'm curious. Sometimes we're sitting here on the second floor and we can look out on the street. And sometimes I see obvious planners, just the way they're dressed, and of course the camera, and sometimes the tape measure gives them away. And I wonder why they haven't called to try to talk. And so many times I'll go out just in a friendly way because we would like to share the concepts of this. And I'm always surprised by the few that act as though they're stealing something from us. And they think it is in the shape or the measurement and the form. And I think, oh my goodness, I so wish they would open up, because that is going to be an absolute failure. Because you can't copy it, because it isn't about any of the physicalness. It's to understand the concept and the relationship. Yeah,
I can't agree more with that. It's the principles. And, for example, the open space requirement, we have here 70%. Now, not all developments can do that. And, if Serenbe has its transect, which goes from lower density to higher density, think of Serenbe's location relative to downtown Atlanta. So there is also a gradient there. And, a parcel of land in downtown Atlanta can't necessarily be 70% open space. So concepts need to be developed about this relationship of open space to built space as you go through that entire transect. 50%, well, just under 50% of the world's population is rural. Most people say, well, 50% of the world's population is urban, meaning that most people are becoming urban. But I like to think that most people are still staying rural.
Right.
So, and obviously Serenbe is in a rural environment. And so there's still a lot of development that can happen like Serenbe in this rural environment, and even the suburban environments for that matter.
Right. I think in the green field, and in that's sort of a insidery term, but basically open land, right, would be an equivalent to that in a rural environment. Or even, we're only 35 minutes from Atlanta, or maybe 40. It's still very, very rural. And so how do we figure out to share this idea? We work on it all the time, with Nygrens Placemaking or the Biophilic Institute, or just even doing press, right? We want to share the concept. But Phill, tell me where, you see the ability to sort of share that concept. I know you've done it a lot with students. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, maybe I'm pessimistic about it. If you look at Seaside, I remember going to Seaside in the early days, and before Seaside was there was these large condos along the beach and golf courses and golf clubs and so on. But and Seaside was a model. And it was thought that maybe all along 30A would be, more interesting kinds of development. So what happened, over the next 50 years, 40 or 50 years, was developments that looked like seaside, but weren't really seaside.
Right.
They took the look, they copied bits and pieces of it. And that's the one thing I agree with Steve here, is to not copy Serenbe, but to go to those principles.
Right.
I think you do exactly what you are doing. You've got these two conferences you put on each year, the biophilic and the placemaking. And you're orienting towards, let's say, designers on one side, and you've got developers on the other side. Mm-hmm. And more of them are beginning to see, the advantages of a place like this, financial advantages as well as the livability advantages. But I think over the next few years, it's going to be piecemeal, how much real influence we have on development. And we're almost waiting for more, this is my own views here, we're waiting for more negative things to happen in the world before we actually start doing things more aggressively. Necessity is the mother of invention. Mm-hmm. And, if we start to experience more sea level rising, look at Venice today.
I know.
It's unbelievable. But again, I also feel that things can be done incrementally.
Right.
Now, at the planning scale, it's harder. You have to have those principles up front, because once you put that infrastructure, that's there for a long time.
Yeah.
The village I lived in England was established by Caesar.
Wow.
The roads. And they were on cardinal directions, which was a Roman thing to do. Mm-hmm. And today, there is South Street and West Street and North Street, and those were established by him.
Right.
Which is amazing. So once you establish that infrastructure, it's pretty much there. Mm-hmm. So that's the critical piece, is to get them to understand the relationship between density and mixes of use and the infrastructure. Because once you put that down, you're locked in.
And does that start with the students or the city planners or a combination? Like where would you put your time?
You got to do it all. You've got to do it all. I gave a lecture, or I was on a review at Kennesaw yesterday, Kennesaw State University. And my closing statements was, you guys are brand new. You're the new, you're third-year students. But when you're my age, you're going to be designing for your grandkids.
Right.
And I'm hoping that you're going to be more aggressive in your approaches towards sustainability and livability and health and wellness. Mm-hmm. And right now, students are still designing in the ways that we did, 50 years ago.
Right.
Unfortunately.
And why do you think that is?
It's partly because of the faculty and partly because of the accreditation requirements. Mm-hmm. For example, biophilia is not a accreditation requirement. It's an elective.
Okay.
And so that's part of the reason that biophilic concepts are not really taught more broadly.
Okay.
So if it were to be a required course, then you'd have more people learning it. It exists on all levels, the professional level, the development level, the architect's level. And but I think ultimately it's the users, because when the users decide that they want to get rid of the automobile, or when they decide that they're going to buy electric cars, and that's happening now, then you see change. Now, what do you see? You see all the other automobile manufacturers doing electric cars. And it took Tesla and a few others to get there. And I think those kind of changes will happen, are happening.
Yeah.
And I think that also incremental change is healthy. To do things too quickly, in Serenbe, if we had done some of our more progressive ideas too early, it never would have happened. And so you have to kind of ease into it.
Right.
And I think we are easing more and more into more and more the principles.
If you compare the layered density in Motto compared to Selborne, it's very different. And you're right. If we had come in with that density immediately in the countryside, it would not have been understood. And
the mandate for geothermal may not have been as interesting or as possible in Selborne. Well, I think that's a whole other subject. That's a matter of educating people, and that with geothermal is a good principle. While it made all the sense in the world, both from sound and energy, reducing your energy demand,
we ended up just having to make it mandatory. And some of these things, you're seeing some cities are actually starting to make some of these principles mandatory. The number of large cities that are really prohibiting cars now, either during specific times or other times. So we're coming into a lot of these principles. They might be called something different, but we're really moving. You look at the value that green space has, whether it's a park. Cities are now starting to understand how to do biophilic bioretention stormwater, because not only is it a wiser thing to do, but it changes property values around those areas. So
right.
This is starting to change in various ways, and it's the demand, the economic demand that's going to move it.
You're right. The consumer is really the one who starts to push that change, as well as creating the knowledge on the planning level. And I think to your point about the larger, ecosystem that we're sitting in, the planet, we have to really start thinking, and you're seeing it happening. People are talking about better capitalism, capitalism that doesn't just take, sales into account or the GDP, that we're actually considering nature and people in that equation. And I don't know, maybe we should start a biophilic economics program or something.
Yes. Well, and it's about lifestyle. And it's really easy for me, being retired now and living in my own house in a community that I was a part of, to say that this is the way things should be. When I was younger, I couldn't afford my house,
Sure.
like many people. But it was something that I aspired to. And I aspired to being able to be off-grid, which one day I will be, totally.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your house. Your house is pretty interesting.
Well, it's I've added things incrementally. The first thing was that it's a small house, 3 bedrooms, but it's only 1,650 square feet, and has an office as well. And so its footprint is relatively small, so that's, I think, a good thing. Secondly, like all homes here in Serenbe, it's Earthcraft certified. And then I have passive solar heating, which is pretty rare here, but I've got an insulated concrete slab for thermal mass and a large glass area. Then I have, when I first moved into the house, I put in my first PV system, and it was 18 panels and a Tesla battery, which is really exciting. And then last winter, I added another 12 panels, so I went up to 30 panels. And this month, I'm adding 5 more, so I'll be at 35.
And why do you do that? Why
to get more energy.
Okay, right. And did you need?
Yeah.
Okay, in order to go net zero.
Yes. Right. So I'm. And I ran out of room on the roof.
Okay.
That's one of the main reasons.
Got to find a place to put a solar array, Steve.
But they cost money.
Yes.
But the problem I have, and probably most people here will have, with geothermal, which is an electricity-driven ground source heat pump.
Okay.
In January December and January, a little bit of February requires the most amount of electricity during the year. Okay, well, December and January and February are the months where you have the least amount of sun. So I have the most demand and the least supply. That's the problem.
Okay.
And I've been talking to a lot of people about how I deal with that. And the answer is more supply and more battery.
I was going to say the battery. Yeah. The batteries aren't there yet.
Yeah. Well, the batteries are there. It's just the quantity of
the amount of energy they can hold at a time.
The amount of energy that you hold.
I see.
I was talking to one of the guys from Hanna Solar. He was saying that they just did a house that has 40,000. Is that 40? Not. It has 40 panels and 4 Tesla batteries.
Okay.
I've got 1. So they're really orienting this thing towards storage.
This is really moving, and Phill was one of the early people pushing solar back in Colorado. What, in the 60s or 70s, Phill? Is that
1973.
Dating you? Okay.
I got out of college in the 60s, late 60s, and like most people at that time, didn't quite know where my career was going. If you might remember, America was in a place,
yes.
which I won't get into. But so 1973 came along, which was the oil embargo, and it gave great purpose to my career. And in 74, I worked on the world's largest solar heated building at the time. It was the Community College of Denver. I was working for a firm in Denver, and that really got me into it. And then about a year later, I broke away from the firm, and we started our own firm. I had two other partners. And we totally focused on solar energy projects. And during the next about 7 years, we won 5 Department of Energy and Department of Energy, or HUD and Department of Energy demonstration grants.
Wow.
And out of those 5, 4 were built.
Okay.
Only 1 didn't get built. And that really, when you win a government grant, you have to go into so much detail and do all the engineering and all that kind of stuff. And we were able to pull those off. And so then the 80s came, and of course the solar tax credits sunsetted in 1985.
Okay.
And it was at that time, by 1985, America was by far the leading country in the world in solar energy. I mean, it was just no doubt about it. We had hundreds or thousands of buildings nationwide that were solar, and all kinds of solar technology was being evolved. 1985, the solar tax credits sunsetted, and the industry just completely died. Nothing.
Yes, because I was going to say today, I would have not realized that had happened.
Well, nothing happened for almost 15 years. Mm-hmm. But what did happen was that solar energy began to take off in Europe.
Okay.
And especially in the 80s and the 90s. Mm-hmm. And not a huge amount, but enough to keep it alive. Mm-hmm. And of course, by the time we got to 2000 and now, I mean, it's just unbelievable, the amount of buildings that are going up that are using solar energy.
And so Phill brought that discipline, and he did sun studies. And as we laid out the omegas, here we are, a dense area in the village, but the legs all face south. So if you design the house correctly, we have taken a path of trees down because of where the houses densely sit. So we do not really have large trees between houses, and so that opens the path to the southern sun, which is what you want for your solar panels. Mm-hmm. So we really haven't forced architects to do that because solar has not been the economical thing that we force. But as batteries become more common and price-wise, I can see the day that we require solar as we did a few years ago with geothermal, because it'll make economic sense. And our land plan then allows architects and all to do that in a responsible way.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think in the future, I think as many houses as we can will have small standalone systems, especially if we move to electric cars throughout, you can imagine, so that you can charge your car. Never have to pay for gas, never have to pay for electricity for your car because you're charging it yourself. And then to couple that with solar farms. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about the future. So you'd have standalones on your house that won't take up the entire roof necessarily, and then solar farms, or other forms of renewables.
So one question would be for like myself, can I retrofit my house for solar?
Absolutely. And there's a limit depending on the complexity of your roof and the orientation of the slopes. Okay. My neighbor across the street is now, and the house has been built for about 4 years now, 3 or 4 years, is putting on a 12-panel system. Okay. And I looked at her October electric bill, and it was $197. And I compared it to mine, which was about $30.
Wow.
So there are real savings that you can, not necessarily she's going to go down to $30, but the solar producer is saying that they think they're going to get that down by half. So I still think that these standalone systems on your house can, and they have a hybrid car, so
they can use a little bit.
They can use a little bit for that. Some houses you can get a lot on, and I'm talking about existing houses, and some are going to be a little bit difficult. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I really do think it's the future. And I think we're just waiting maybe for Georgia to come in with some tax credits also, as well as making it a little more economical. Is that where we're waiting for?
I think so. And also the way that you if you're tied into the grid, if I charge my batteries at night using a lower rate. Then I've got, instead of using the sun, and then I use the battery power and the sun during the day, then I can become off-grid.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The development of batteries for energy independence, I think, is going to move this from the market base faster than anything. And so, Phill, we've skipped over your career from when I found you in Washington. And shortly after, then you took over as head of the department at Texas A&M as the architectural. And as at the time, I think you said that it's the largest architectural school in the United States.
That's right. I had nearly 1,000 students and 65 faculty, more than half of whom had PhDs. So it was a very interesting time, I guess. And not only that, I was going through accreditation. And that's really difficult. But it was I liked working at Texas A&M because it afforded me the opportunity to go to Italy on one thing. And another one was once you're a department head, you really understand the nature of architectural education. You have to know all facets of it. What's the curriculum and hiring faculty and getting the right resources together. But I'm trying to think of the year, it was about 2003, Dean Tom Reagan mandated for the college that all undergraduate students in the college had to have a long semester away, meaning outside of College Station.
Okay.
And not the summer. So, and they had two choices. One was to go to a study abroad program or to work in an intern program. And it turns out that probably 2/3 opted for the study abroad and 1/3 the intern. And the intern program was to some degree oriented towards students that couldn't really afford to go to Italy or to Spain. And it was a good way for them to make some money while they're working. So we had a program in Barcelona and one in Castiglione Fiorentino, Italy. Then the recession happened, and families were reluctant to send their kids abroad because it was typically about $18,000 to $19,000 a semester to do one of these. That included tuition and room and board and travel. So it still was expensive. So that's when I came up with the idea of perhaps doing something at Serenbe. And it took a few years for that to happen. And I believe it was 2015, we finally got our first group. And it was only 6 students, but they really had a great time. I was worried, Italy, Barcelona, Georgia. It's like, for somebody from Texas, sure. It's like, but the second they got here, they got it. and I thought they were going to spend every weekend outside of Serenbe, exploring and going to Atlanta and stuff. Nope. What did they do? They stayed here.
Yeah.
And they just loved the tranquility of it and the peacefulness and hanging out in the Daisy and so on. They would just set up shop in the Daisy and do a lot of their work there. So it was, I think, beneficial for Serenbe because we worked on only projects, in Serenbe. And it gave the students an opportunity to work with, like, real clients.
Right.
And at the end of the semester, they would present their work to the community at Gainey Hall, and that was really rewarding for both the community, I think, and the students. And then the next year, we did another one. And it was great for me because that year I got to do that and watch the construction of my house. So.
That's going to say, so in the midst of this, then you decided to actually buy a lot here and design and build your own house.
That's right.
And then you retired, what year?
2017.
And moved here full time.
Yep. I liked the lot that I'm at. I built a small cottage house on an estate lot. So I got the land and I have a small house. But another thing, in the original days of Serenbe, one of the taglines was, if I can get it correct, is living amongst
a village of people living in a village of trees.
Yes. And I took that to heart on my property because I took down the fewest amount of trees you can take down. I mean, there are trees that are like 6 inches away from my house. And I love it because when you walk around, you just see these trees.
Yeah, no, it's gorgeous.
And it's a great house. We'll have to put pictures of the house on the webpage.
And going back to biophilia, it's one of those terms that I think we knew Serenbe was all about, but we never really used the term in the early days. Mm-hmm. If you look at all the principles that are surrounding biophilia, you'll see that that's here at Serenbe. And my house in particular, again, I wasn't designing it as a biophilic house. It was just designing my house, in Serenbe. And it turns out that it has a tremendous number of these biophilic principles, which I think is really cool. And yesterday, I just got a contract from Routledge for my 6th book called Biophilic Urbanism.
So exciting.
And Tim Bately is writing the foreword to that.
Congratulations.
And so I'm really excited because other than his work in biophilic cities, there's nothing really out there on biophilic urbanism. And probably a third of the book is going to be on Serenbe.
So exciting.
And then 2/3 the publisher required that I look at a lot of other projects around the world.
Sure.
So
that's great. Well, one thing that I'd like to talk about is the building of the labyrinth. And this relates to some of the patterns as you think about it. Because when we were at Chartres Cathedral, we saw the pattern and as a family and talked about, wouldn't it be fun to do something like this with stone in the woods? And then a couple of years passed, and Marie ran into these folks that said they were starting to facilitate building labyrinths. So we decided what a grand idea. And that's when we sent the invitation out. And, of course, Phill joined. And that was when we had not started Serenbe yet. We had the plans, and we were in the active planning. And so Phill was one of the 40 people that came that weekend. And, of course, it started on Thursday evening. And this was an area that when we were deciding where it should go, I said, well, there's a fairly flat area over the lake, and I find I meditate there a lot. So I think this, would be the place. And so we flattened it a little bit, put the base rocks, brought the rocks from the farm. And then from Thursday night, it happened. We started, and they divided us into 5 teams, and Phill was in charge of the center. And so his team worked on the center while the rest of us worked at setting rocks according to the plans. And so by Sunday morning, this beautiful labyrinth was completely done, and we did the dedications. Everyone brought a rock. And Phill wasn't leaving until the next morning. And so that night at dinner, I said, Phill, how does this fit in to our sacred geometry? We became so involved in planning that we didn't talk much about sacred geometry. It was just, where are we going to plan and where are we going to put this? And about 6 months after we had the plan and the civil engineers were doing all the engineering and grading, it dawned on me at one of Phil's visits. I said, what's the pattern? Do we have a sacred geometry pattern here? And Phill says, well, that's a good question. Let me identify the key points. And then you came back, and you might tell about the pattern that you identified.
It's Fibonacci's kite, which was especially derivative out of Selborne, because you have Selborne Way coming in on an angle to the top of the omega, and then you had the stream on the other side coming in at the same angle. And they both point right to the center of the omega. And those lines actually formed a pentagon. And then when you extend 2 of the lines of the pentagon down, you get what's called Fibonacci's kite.
And it's amazing when I watch people posing for pictures or pausing, how many times they're standing in these key sites. One that everyone will identify with is the bench in the wall below the Hill restaurant is one of those points. Oh. And it's amazing that so there are physical places throughout Serenbe that these are identified. When we were doing the labyrinth and Phill was not flying out until the next morning, Phill said there was such energy for these 3 days when we were working there. Do you have the map here? Let's roll out the map of Serenbe and let's see how it fits in to the kite.
Oh.
And to the amazement, without any pre-planning or even thinking about this, it formed a perfect triangle.
Yeah.
with the market green, the center of the market green, and the hill that's been identified for a fire pavilion that has not been built yet, but it's on the main path coming through Selborne.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because maybe these things are done subconsciously, I don't know, or maybe there's other powers that are here guiding this process, but it's not necessarily a conscious process that's going on there.
Well, and I've often identified when people are starting to understand it, that there are energies within ourselves and within the earth and the atmosphere. And while you might think of this as a new age, if you ask any of the old-time farmers here how to find water in a well, they bring out the divining rod. And it's an understanding there is an energy force. It's an energy grid that happens. And if we sort of calm ourselves in meditation or whatever it is, we can actually feel that on some level.
Well, one of the points I wanted to share, and this is one of the early stories with Steve, when we were walking the land and we came into the area around where Selborne is now, and it was just all woods. There was only one thing here that was human-made, and it was a deer stand right across the street, I think. It might have been right about here, which is kind of interesting. And we pondered for a moment, and we said, can't you just see it? And we even used, I think, this kind of curve, can't you just see it? There's houses and shops and restaurants and all this stuff. And I kept thinking, this is maybe the skeptic in me. Maybe we're both imagining something that really isn't going to happen, but it sure is fun to kind of luxuriate in this image.
Yeah.
And, here we are, probably almost on the site where that deer stand was. And then you look around and here's Selborne. And I was talking earlier about the early days of Serenbe. And this was before there was very much built. And these are my reflections, but there were three things that really made Serenbe successful, particularly in those early days. The first was the land. And when anybody ever came out here, they walked the land, and you got the sense of the quality of the land. The second thing was Steve and Marie's enthusiasm and vision and excitement about doing something here. And the third in those days was the plan. Because that's all, you had the land, the plan, and the idea. And it was amazing because that drove it into realization in those early days.
I love that. That's wonderful. So I want to say thank you to both of you.
Yeah, thank you.
For coming and spending this time with us.
Thanks, Phill, for sharing today and for the last 20 years. It's been really fun watching us dream together, and now you put it on paper and we build it. And it's been a great friendship and relationship. It
sure has. And it's been a blessing for me, so thanks.
Thank you for listening to Serenbe Stories. New episodes are available on Mondays. Please rate and review the podcast and make sure to email your questions for Steve Nygren to stories@serenbe.com. You may even get to hear them on the podcast. More details about episodes and guests are available on our website, serenbestories.com.